Alright, well, I should start this out by saying that I'm a pretty big Ratchet and Clank fan. I got into the series back in 2008. It's weird to think that I'm basically a veteran of the series at this point, even though I got into the series after many other people. Now I feel old. While I wouldn't say I'm the type of person to play these games every other month, I've played most of the series at least twice, so I know my way around a sheepinator, so understand it's with as much love as I can possibly muster when I say this. I think you should all be wary of Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart. I think there's a distinct possibility that game could be a disappointment, and I think the fans should slow down the hype train. Obviously, we've seen very little about the game so far, and in fact, as I'm writing this script, the release date has just been announced. Really, we haven't seen much more than a few trailers at time of writing. And the revealed trailer didn't really tell us all that much, except that this game is going to feature dimension hopping and Rule 63 Ratchet, aka the definition of furry bait. Let's be real though, they knew exactly what they were doing when they designed this character. We don't even know her name yet, and yet the fan base already has an overwhelming obsession with her. So I'm already sick of seeing her. And once again, we don't even know her name yet. Though I think I have a pretty good name for her. Jackie. Why? Because a jack, much like a ratchet, is a mechanical tool, and Jackie is exactly what the entire fan base was doing to her from the moment they saw her. I hope the people watching this know the definition of irony. So what makes me say that there's a distinct possibility that the game may be disappointing? 2 words: pattern recognition. I've been with the Ratchet and Clank series for long enough to realize that the current direction is questionable at best, and I think the origins of this questionable direction can be traced all the way back to 2007's Ratchet and Clank Future: Tools of Destruction. Tools of Destruction was a pivotal point in the series where they threw away the established plot, gameplay, and tone, all to build it up again from the ground up. I think that Tools of Destruction was okay, but very lacking in a lot of ways. One of those games that I played through all the way to the end and thought that the experience was perfectly functional but very bland. If you like the game, more power to you, but it just didn't click with me. But even I will admit that Tools of Destruction was made worth it in that it was a means to an end to get us to a crack in time. A crack in time, or clock blocked if you will, is without a doubt one of the best games in the series. It was an incredibly well put together game in pretty much every way and features many of my favorite sequences in the entire series. But when I think back to A Crack in Time, all of its best moments had to do with the story and not necessarily the gameplay, because even from A Crack in Time, a somewhat negative trend was emerging. As good as the gameplay was in A Crack in Time, it's basically the exact same thing as Tools of Destruction, with a few extra bits tacked on to slightly differentiate the experience. Don't get me wrong, it works, but one of the things that defined a series up until Tools of Destruction was the fact that each game, while ostensibly having the same gameplay formula, felt completely different thanks to unique weapon selections, gadget selections, and gimmicks. Hell, Deadlocked was a completely different gameplay formula altogether, and that game kicks all kinds of ass. It's insulting that people insist it's the game that you can skip. Each of the first 4 games were similar enough that they felt like they were part of the same series, but they were each unique enough that they were able to have their own identities. But starting from A Crack in Time, they basically recycled the gameplay shot for shot with minimal changes from Tools of Destruction. You see the same weapons returning over and over, and the games always feel the same. If you want to try and pull the "oh, well, a rocket launcher's a rocket launcher" thing, that's bullshit. Each of the first 4 games had a bunch of unique weapons and gadgets, and when they did have returning weapons, they actually made a big deal out of it. Some weapons functioned similarly, but you rarely, if ever, had any weapons that felt the same, so each game felt unique to play. Weapon variety is the bread and butter of Ratchet and Clank, and yet, since they decided that Tools of Destruction was as good as it's gonna get, we haven't had any of that. In terms of feel and overall weapon selection, every game, all for one excluded, has had pretty much the exact same weapon selection and overall feel to the gameplay, and based on what we've seen so far, Rift Apart doesn't seem to be straying too far from that norm, if at all. Here's what I mean. The Combustor has featured in 5 separate games, and when did it debut? Tools of Destruction. The Fusion Grenades have featured in 5 separate games and debuted in Tools of Destruction. The Groovitron featured in 4 separate games. Guess what? Debuted in Tools of Destruction. The Buzzblades, Magnet Launcher, Predator Launcher, Negotiator, and so on, they all appeared in multiple games and debuted in Tools of Destruction. Not as a cool throwback or anything, just as a nonchalant addition like any other weapon. How can I get excited for a game when chances are good that it's going to play and feel exactly like the last several games with maybe a few unique weapons or a unique gimmick or 2? They were so proud of themselves for the pixelizer in Ratchet & Clank 2016 that they wouldn't shut up about it. But there was once a time when you'd sell the game on a selection of weapons. So what happened? If you can't think of any new ideas and have to keep recycling old content, maybe reconsider, well, everything. This isn't like reusing and repurposing character models like they would do in the early series. This is the fundamental thrust of the series, and it's felt exactly the same for over a decade. Besides, of the first 5 games, I'm doing everything to forget the high-impact games ever existed, Tools of Destruction is easily the least interesting as far as gameplay is concerned, and yet, that's the one we've recycled over and over? Really? Feel free to disagree with me, but that's like getting to collab with any of the Beatles and willingly choosing Ringo. Maybe they're trying to have a more iconic weapon selection, but why? You know what's iconic? The Omni Wrench. That's a weapon synonymous with Ratchet and Clank. That's a weapon that people think of when they think of Ratchet and Clank. Who thinks of the combustor when Ratchet and Clank comes up? So if iconic weaponry is the reason for all this, why are we going for attempted, and I mean attempted iconography over actual gameplay variety? I'd take at least an attempt at a decent weapon selection over constantly recycling the same weak-ass Tools of Destruction weapons over and over. Because at least then we'd have a chance of these games not consistently being the same over and over. Speaking of recycling content from previous games, this is where I think the most recent Ratchet and Clank games have fallen down, and Rift Apart is going to be no different. It's been revealed that Dr. Nefarious is going to be the villain. Yet again. I am so sick of this. If I may digress a moment, look, I like Dr. Nefarious. I really do. He was great in Up Your Arsenal and he was great in A Crack in Time, but Rift Apart will be the 5th game in the Ratchet and Clank series where he will have played a major role. I am so sick to death of having Dr. Nefarious in these games. He was a great villain, don't get me wrong, but he's been so overused and overexposed to the point that I just don't want to see him in these games anymore. I want to see something new. Into the Nexus featured 3 new villains, and they were pretty good. Vendra and Neftin weren't amazing, but their parallels with Ratchet made for some interesting character work and really showed how the same backstory can create 2 utterly diametrically opposed paths for characters to travel. And Mr. I, well, he was more of a force of nature than a villain, but he served his purpose pretty well. Into the Nexus is pretty up there as being one of my favorite Ratchet and Clank games, if only because it's one of the few ones after A Crack in Time that actually tries to do something new. And when I say something new, I mean try something new that's good. For example, it's not a tower defense game for Christ's sake. Diametrically opposed to Into the Nexus is Ratchet and Clank 2016, which is probably my least favorite Ratchet and Clank game out of the entire series, excluding the horrible spin-offs by High Impact Games. One of the main reasons for this is the fact that at the 11th hour they decide, by the way, Dr. Nefarious is now the main villain. He wasn't even in the game that Ratchet 2016 was based off of, and him becoming the villain of Ratchet 2016 came out of nowhere at pretty much the end of the game. So it was the most forced thing ever. But nope, Dr. Nefarious is the recognizable name the fans want. Well, I'm a fan and I'm sick of seeing the same thing. So they sacrificed the person who was supposed to be the villain because that's how the original game that this was a remake of went, or remaster, or reimagining or whatever, all to make the main villain the same person that's been the main villain multiple times already, and doing so in the most shoehorned way possible. Why? Why do we have to have the same villain over and over? Yes, Captain Quark was a villain in the first 2 games, but that was part of a 3-game arc. With Dr. Nefarious, we've been through the song and dance 3 times with him as the main villain already, and once more with him as an ally. At this point, what could we possibly see that we haven't seen already? Like, am I the one taking crazy pills here? Is it weird that I'm sick of seeing the same villain over and over in a series that used to be known for great one-off villains? Even if I am crazy here, isn't it better to have different villains with different possibilities of storytelling over constant repetition of the same thing? And that's why when I heard that Dr. Nefarious is coming back, yet again in Rift Apart, I just put my head in my hands. I don't know how many times and how many ways I can say that I'm sick of Dr. Nefarious, but I'm just so sick of Dr. Nefarious. There's nothing that he can bring to the table that already wasn't brought to the table multiple times. It might be true that Ratchet and Clank doesn't have many iconic villains to choose from, at least ones they haven't killed off yet, but the solution to that is to make new villains. Don't keep bringing out the same geriatric robot that we've seen every single trope of over and over and over. Like, maybe they'll swerve us. Maybe the main villain will end up being someone else like they did in A Crack in Time, but once again, being able to recognize the patterns that the series follows, I have very little faith that they're actually going to do something interesting or new with this. God. Now, here's another thing. As I've already mentioned, Tools of Destruction represented a massive paradigm shift as far as the presentation of Ratchet and Clank. The first several games were satirical, cynical, very raunchy at times, and also very dark at times, but also had a lot of genuine emotion. The best way to describe the tone and writing of the first several Ratchet & Clank games would be like a really high-quality Adult Swim cartoon. Then you have the Future Trilogy, which I prefer to describe as a really high-quality Cartoon Network show or a really well-made animated movie. It emphasizes the heart and emotion and focuses more on mature writing and character work while leaving behind a lot of the raunchiness and adult themes that the previous games had. The humor was still present, but it was much less dark and had much more widespread appeal. All that really worked for the Future Trilogy and is one of the reasons why I think A Crack in Time is easily one of the best Ratchet & Clank games. Sure, the tone shift might have been a bit jarring to longtime fans, but it worked for the story that they were telling. The problem is, after that story was over, they kept the same tone and humor style. So basically, from Tools of Destruction onward, you had a much different tone and writing style to the PS2 games, but had a story that worked for that writing style. Then you finish that story, but keep the same writing style for later games. So you eliminated what was good about the PS2 games, but no longer have what made the PS3 games work. That further goes to show why I think that Ratchet & Clank 2016 was the weakest game in the main series, because they took the story of the original game and put it through the filter of Tools of Destruction's writing style. So it was the first game without what made that game work, but also the future games without what made them work, so you got the worst of both worlds. I hold true that the story and presentation of Ratchet 2016 was some of the most cringeworthy I've ever had the displeasure of experiencing. It was childishly written and cringeworthy from the word go. It was the first game, again, but rewritten by a 6-year-old hopped up on enough pixie sticks to down a small elephant and fueled by 5-year-old dank memes, demonstrating that Insomniac Games had lost the plot as to what made Ratchet & Clank good in its original run, or the Future Trilogy. Somehow they went from cynical raunch to solid heartfelt storytelling to downright childishness. Sure, the gameplay has been good, but it's been the same good that we've already gotten multiple times since 2007, so if I can't have a new exciting gameplay experience, at least give me a well-written story. But modern Ratchet & Clank is neither of those things. And I don't have any reason to believe that Rift Apart will be any different. I'm hoping that the story of Rift Apart will be good enough and dramatic enough to justify the writing style of the Future Trilogy, because I know for a fact that they are absolutely not going back to the style of presentation of the PS2 games, because the developers have made it clear that they think the PS2 games are cringeworthy in their writing.
Jeez, come on, man. We are no longer in our 20s.
Is it cringy now? Like,
it is. It's totally
cringy
for me. It is. It's. I don't. Yeah.
People love it
though. Moved
on. People love it. They love that. There's like a lot of people like, man, I love that humor in the first few games. Still to this day. Maybe they haven't grown up.
Shut the fuck up!
Yeah, Ted. Love you, buddy. You're responsible for some of my favorite games of all time, but have you actually played Ratchet 2016 if you think that this is cringeworthy? This is a point that I hope to be proven wrong on, and I might be proven wrong on, but hey, that's why this video is called Why You Should Be Wary of Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart, not why Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart will definitely totally suck. And you know, I am very interested to see how Rift Apart goes. The fact that they're returning to the original continuity after the 2016 reimagining shows a lot of self-awareness, something that they've been sorely lacking for the last few years, because one of the things I hated about Into the Nexus was the fact that it ended on an unresolved cliffhanger, and an unresolved cliffhanger, I might add, that was completely unnecessary. So I'm glad that they're going back and finishing what they started, even though Ratchet 2016 was a wild success critically and commercially. Ratchet 2016 was a travesty and the worst of both worlds in a lot of ways, but Insomniac Games won me back with Spider-Man 2018. They showed that they can make incredible game engines with incredible gameplay, and they can make incredible stories with incredibly likable characters. I'm not too proud to admit that I started welling up at the end of Spider-Man when that thing happens that I won't spoil. So I have faith in Insomniac Games that they can take this continuity, which they haven't touched since 2013, and do something really good with it. The question is, will they though? Even though I'm back on the Insomniac Games bandwagon, I don't ever want to give anything the benefit of the doubt because I've been burnt too many times. Besides, lest we forget, the last Ratchet & Clank game that's uncontroversially considered a classic was made in 2009. They've made one solid game, a few subpar spin-offs, and a load of old wank since, but nothing that's made a lasting impact. And while they may be showing some self-awareness and hopping back to the original continuity, they're also being a bit selective with their self-awareness with the whole Dr. Nefarious thing, so I don't know. I may be a fan of the series, but that doesn't mean that I don't tell it how it is. Ratchet & Clank is a great series, but also contains one of the worst games I've ever played. Don't at me. I may be a fan of things, but I don't have blind loyalty towards anything, and I don't think you should either. If you can't criticize what you love, it'll never improve. It'll stagnate and slowly die. That's the opposite of what I want for Ratchet & Clank. I want it to continue and be stronger than it's ever been before. If I had to make my predictions, I'd say that Rift Apart is going to be a gorgeous looking game with slightly inconsistent facial animation. We're going to be seeing some BioWare style 1,000-yard stares is what I mean, but the gameplay is going to be the same as the last several games with 1 or 2 unique spins. Methinks dimension hopping is going to play a big part in it, and it'll work similar to how it worked in Bioshock Infinite. We'll probably switch between Ratchet and Rule 63 Ratchet when the story dictates, which might make for some fun switch-ups to the core gameplay. I'm sure they'll have their own strengths and weaknesses. We'll see a return of many weapons, and 1 or 2 unique ones that they'll throw in your face, like maybe a gun that shoots bears, but the broad strokes will be exactly the same. It'll be a perfectly solid, perfectly functional game that we've all played before. I've never seen an Insomniac game that wasn't finished at launch, so I don't think we'll have that to worry about, but I do expect not to be blown away. I think the game is going to be childishly written like 2016 with faintly desperate attempts to seem hip and up to date. I expect parodies of TikTok, Donald Trump, and whatever else is obvious and slightly dated, and I expect to sigh at every single one. I also expect them to make slightly uncalled for parodies of people like the Gaming Brit and other such people who weren't impressed with 2016 in general. Maybe they'll make a fat, nerdy character who complains that Ratchet's current adventure will never measure up to his old adventures, and they're going to be placed as the butt of the joke in the most strawman of strawman moves. He's gonna be like Al, but somehow more pathetic. Then call me crazy, I expect there to be constant, never-ending, unnecessary dialogue running through the entire game until you want to stick a cordless drill through your ears. I expect the game to be 6 to 8 hours long and basically be okay, but fail to measure up to what we've come to and should expect. Because, as I've said, Insomniac Games has lost the plot as to what made Ratchet & Clank good originally, or even in the future trilogy. And finally, I'm gonna make a bold prediction. I think Rift Apart is gonna be the final Ratchet & Clank game. It's no secret that Ratchet & Clank doesn't have a theoretically infinite shelf life the same way that Mario or Zelda does. It's an ongoing story with ongoing characters, and eventually that has to end. Plus, the gameplay isn't so flexible that they could get away with the same story over and over the same way that Mario and Zelda are able to. I think that A Crack in Time could have, and in many ways should have been the end, because while the main overarching plot wasn't necessarily resolved, the plot line about both Ratchet and Clank becoming satisfied with the lives they had meant that they were able to find closure without Ratchet having to find his own people. But Insomniac didn't really have any more strings to their bow back then, and so as a result, after A Crack in Time, the series ran in circles for years trying to recapture what was good about the games. Then, since A Crack in Time, Insomniac Games has become the designated developer of Spider-Man, and guess what? Spider-Man PS4 was a monumental success, becoming their best-selling game almost instantly. Ratchet & Clank has a limited shelf life, isn't getting any younger, and is becoming less and less central to the identity of the developer with each passing moment. I could be proven wrong about this. I could be proven wrong about all of this. I hope that I'm wrong about everything I just said. I hope Rift Apart is an all-time classic game that utterly blows every Ratchet & Clank game to date out of the water. But our future is often dictated by our past, and the future of Ratchet & Clank, in my estimation, doesn't look that good at all. I'm not saying that Rift Apart is going to be bad. All I'm saying is, be aware that the things you're looking forward to might be massive disappointments. I hope this video doesn't age well because I want Rift Apart to be an all-time classic. The ball's in your court now, Insomniac. Don't drop it. And if you like what you see, don't forget to like and subscribe and drop a comment about why I'm wrong. Maybe then my dad will come back from the gas station. Until next time, you've been watching Tactical Bacon Productions, saying what I want, when I want. Peace.